Tissues of the body are groups of cells and the extracellular matrix in which they are embedded. Although there are many tissue subtypes, all body tissues fall into 4 basic categories: epithelial tissues, muscle tissue, connective tissue, and nervous tissue. Developmentally, tissues differentiate into these 4 categories based on the general types of proteins that their cells manufacture. Subtle differences in the proteins from one individual to another result in tissue types that may lead to immunological incompatibilities and post-surgical rejections after organ transplants. Autotransplants, movement of tissues within the same individual, avoid these problems. However, in homotransplants involving different individuals of the same species, and in heterotransplants involving different species, rejection of the transplanted tissue by the recipient is quite common.
Hi, I'm Mike Shively, and welcome to Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. Does anyone have a question from last time?
I did. I had a question about why cancer makes masses or tumors, you know.
Cancer or neoplasia is actually uncontrolled cell division. Normally, organs grow up to a certain size and they stop growing. Tissues only go so far, they stop. The exact control mechanisms of those things are not totally understood in many cases. But when we have a cancer or a neoplasm, for some reason the normal control mechanisms are non-functional, and so tissue continues to grow out of control. We have cellular division without the normal controls on it, and so the mass normally increases and gets larger and larger. As you know, cancers are divided into what we call benign cancers or benign tumors, as well as malignant ones. And the benign ones are ones where the growth is so slow that essentially it's not life-threatening. In malignancies, the uncontrolled tissue growth is out of control at such a fast rate that vital organs, vital processes in the body can be interfered with, and it can then be life-threatening. Kind of interesting that the uncontrolled growth in and of itself is not what is bad about cancer, but the fact that some vital process eventually is interfered with by the tissue growth. Today we want to talk about histology. Let's go to our overhead camera for just a moment and look at this word, histology. We know that this means study of, ology. And this is a word root that refers to tissue. So basically we're talking about the study of tissue. For all practical purposes, histology can be considered to be synonymous with microscopic anatomy. So we're basically going to talk today about things in the body that are too small to be seen with the naked eye. But we want to talk about those because it's important to understand enough of the histology that we can make sense of the gross structure of various organs and parts of the body. Now, we defined tissue, I think, in our first or second session as a group of similar cells and their products. And we can take all of the tissues in the body and divide them into 4 basic groups, or four what we call the 4 basic tissues. Let's go back to that overhead camera for just a moment. Somebody name, from your reading, I hope you've been doing, somebody name one of the 4 basic tissues.
Muscle tissue.
Bryce? Okay, muscle tissue. Now that stuff contracts, doesn't it? What's another basic tissue, Hazel?
Epithelium.
Epithelium. And we can say epithelium, or we can say epithelial tissue. A third one. Adam?
Nervous tissue?
Nervous tissue. And the last one? Anybody?
Connective tissue.
Connective tissue. Now, An organ is a structure that is composed of two or more kinds of tissue. These are the four basic tissues, and there are subdivisions of each of these, and we're going to talk about those today. Some tissues, the cells actually secrete quite a few extracellular products, and so there may be cells interspersed among a lot of things that they have also produced themselves but are not inside the cells. Other tissues, there's very little extracellular material, so the tissues are composed of basically cell to cell to cell in very tight configurations. Let's take a look at a graphic that summarizes the kinds of things that we would find in a tissue. Basically, we see cells, and then the extracellular material is called the extracellular matrix. Now, extracellular is the same basic term as intercellular. I-N-T-E-R means between cells, and extra means outside of cells. So basically, if we're outside of cells, we're between cells. That extracellular matrix, which the cells themselves manufacture, may be fluid, as it is in the case of blood. It may be firm, as it is in the case of cartilage. It may be hard, as it is in bone tissue. Okay? So, let's take the four basic tissues and see if we can think of what they do functionally, just as a general category. Okay, the first tissue that we mentioned probably was muscle tissue. We already said it contracts. That's its job. And by contracting, we mean the cells physically get shorter. And when they get shorter, then they accomplish something that the body needs done. If we're talking about skeletal muscles, perhaps we're talking about body movement. If we're talking about smooth muscle tissue within blood vessel walls, perhaps we're talking about making that blood vessel constrict down to change blood pressure or change the amount of blood that's flowing to a certain area. If we're talking about cardiac muscle tissue, the contraction actually causes the heart to squeeze down on the blood within its chambers and thus pump the blood throughout the vessels in the body. Epithelium, we mentioned epithelium. What does it do? What kinds of things does epithelium do?
It secretes.
Adam? Okay, Adam says it secretes, and that's true. One big category of epithelium secretes things. Glandular epithelium secretes things, but there's another category of epithelium that basically doesn't secrete, but it does a very other important function. What's that, Susan?
That it covers the body.
Covers surfaces. And so when we think of epithelial tissue, we want to think of a tissue that either secretes something or it covers body surfaces. And when we say body surfaces, we mean not only the outer covering of the body, but we also mean the linings of all of the hollowed out structures within the body. So it covers both the outer surfaces of the body and the inner surfaces and linings of various organs and structures. All right, nervous tissue, that's a pretty obvious one. What does it do? Eva?
It conducts impulses, electrical impulses.
Conducts impulses, and those electrochemical phenomena are used by the body as a communication, a way of one part of the body communicating with another part. So those, what we call them nervous impulses, travel down neurons and then interact with cells at the other end of the neuron and thus send messages from point 1 to point 2 within the body. That's basically what nervous tissue does. Then the last category, which we call connective tissue, kind of interesting. It's almost a wastebasket category because anything in the body that is not muscle tissue or epithelial tissue or nervous tissue falls into this last category that we call connective tissue. Certainly, as its name implies, it does connect parts of the body, other parts of the body together, but it has many diverse functions as well because there's many subtypes of connective tissue. Let's look at a graphic that summarizes the functions that we've just mentioned of the various tissues. To summarize what we just said one more time, muscle tissue contracts. Epithelial tissue covers surfaces or secretes. Connective tissue, in general, forms a structural framework, and nervous tissue conducts impulses. Now, even though we said there are only 4 basic categories of tissue, we can subdivide those 4 basic tissues into several subtypes each. And so let's do that, because we're going to talk about today muscle tissue and epithelium, but we're going to take a moment and take a look at the subdivisions of the other basic tissues as well. So we'll look at a graphic that shows the subdivisions of muscle tissue and epithelium. Muscle tissue is divided into three basic categories itself. We have skeletal muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue. Now, the skeletal muscle tissue is found within the named skeletal muscles of the body, and it's also found within the wall of the esophagus. That's the only place that you find skeletal muscle tissue besides within a named skeletal muscle. The skeletal muscles of the body are, when we think of our muscles, that's what we're talking about, the skeletal muscles, the ones that cause body movement. Cardiac muscle tissue, as its name implies, is found within the heart, but a little bit of it extends out into some of the large vessels that are close to the heart. In other words, we find a little bit of cardiac muscle tissue in the aorta and a little bit of it in the pulmonary trunk. Smooth muscle tissue is the most diversely distributed muscle tissue in the body. We find it in several different locations. First of all, it's found within the walls of blood vessels and larger lymphatic vessels. It's also found within the walls of the organs of the visceral body systems. It's found at the base of hair follicles, and when it contracts in that location, we get what we call goosebumps. Finally, there's some smooth muscle tissue found within the eye, where that smooth muscle tissue controls the diameter of the pupillary opening and also controls the thickness of the lens. So those are the three subtypes of muscle tissue. Now let's go back to that graphic, the same graphic one more time, and take a look at the subdivisions of epithelium. We said that epithelium either covers surfaces or it secretes. And if the particular epithelium that we're talking about is an epithelium that's primarily involved in surface covering, we call that membranous epithelium. Some histologists will refer to this as surface epithelium because it does cover a surface. So those are synonymous. The official nomenclature requires us to use membranous epithelium. And then, if the epithelium that we're talking about primarily is involved in secreting some substance, we call that glandular epithelium. So those are the two subdivisions of epithelium. And before we leave this graphic, we'll notice that nervous tissue has no subdivisions. It's not subdivided at all. There are two populations of cells that are found within nervous tissue. The cells that we call neurons are impulse-conducting cells, and the other cells that support the neurons in various physical and metabolic ways are called neuroglia, or glial cells. And when we get to the nervous system, we'll clarify that and talk about the various kinds of neurons and the various kinds of glial cells. So just to review what we just looked at, three kinds of muscle tissue, two big categories of epithelium, and nervous tissue is not subdivided. Now, we want to go to the last category of basic tissue and take a look at the subtypes of connective tissue. So we'll look at a graphic that shows the subtypes of connective tissue here, and you'll notice there's a whole bunch. Fibrous connective tissue is sometimes called connective tissue proper. You have to be very careful not to confuse it with the name, if you use that latter name, not to confuse it with the name of the basic category. So the basic category is connective tissue. One of its subtypes is CT proper, or, as you can see here, fibrous connective tissue. Another subtype that everybody is familiar with, of course, is bone tissue. And we're going to talk in a session or two about the skeletal system, so we'll talk some more about that tissue at that time. Cartilage is one of the connective tissues. Blood is one of the connective tissues. And by the way, it's the only fluid tissue. Now, it's not the only fluid in the body, but it's the only fluid that has a high enough cellular content to deserve the name tissue. Adipose tissue, what's this commonly called out on the street? Fat. Yeah. Adipose tissue is really connective tissue proper that has just a lot of fat cells in it. So the fat cells themselves are called adipocytes, or we can just call them fat cells. And if there's a lot of those present, then we say, oh, that's adipose tissue. Bone marrow tissue is different than bone tissue, and it's found in the medullary cavities of bones. So don't confuse the fact that they both have bone in their name and get these two confused a bit. So it's easy to do. Reticular connective tissue is the structural framework that's found within some of the lymphocyte-producing organs of the body, like lymph nodes and thymus and that sort of thing. And then finally, primitive connective tissue down here, also called mesenchyme, you can see that word in parentheses, is a primitive form of connective tissue where the cells are relatively undifferentiated. We talked about differentiation last time, where cells change form from a more primitive cellular type into a more specific cellular type. It's kind of like doing a job change, you know. You've been a carpenter for a while, and now you're going to be a college professor, you know. Maybe you have to go back and do some retraining and buzz up a bit. But that's what mesenchymal cells can do. And when we have injuries in the body, mesenchymal cells can, in fact, differentiate into other needed cells as necessary, in many cases, to fill in what has been lost or what has been injured. Now, we'll consider each one of these subdivisions in a little bit more detail in our discussion. But before we go there, I want to compare the four basic tissues in regard to a couple of things. First of all, I want to take a look at their regenerative capacities. Now, by regenerative capacity, what we mean is if this kind of tissue in some body structure is injured or lost, okay, it suffers some kind of a traumatic incident, how easy is it for the body to replace that lost tissue? How easy is it for this tissue to regenerate? And of course, that has some real implications for traumatic incidents. If you lay your Harley down on pavement, for example, and grind away certain parts of your body, some of those can be replaced relatively easy with some time by your body, and some of them simply cannot be replaced. Let's look at a graphic that compares the regenerative capacities of these four basic tissues. Up here you can see that muscle tissue has a very low regenerative capacity. So if you suffer severe injury to muscle tissue, that can be quite serious. Epithelium, on the other hand, has a high regenerative capacity. If you lose, say, some skin on the surface of your body, the body, with some time, has the ability to regenerate that lost tissue, unless you lose such a large amount at one time that the body can't maintain homeostasis, in which case you can get in trouble. Connective tissue also has high regenerative capacity. If you break a bone, it will, in fact, heal with some time. Nervous tissue, very low regenerative capacity. If you kill neurons, they're dead. And in the adult, neurons do not divide. So whatever you got, take care of them, because that's what you're going to work with for the rest of your life. So we see that two of the basic tissues have low regenerative capacity, and two of the basic tissues have high regenerative capacity. Now, most organs, before we go any further, most organs are composed of several different kinds of tissue. If we look at a bone, for example, there's several kinds of the subtypes of connective tissue within it. There's epithelium lining the blood vessels. There's nervous tissue within it. So when you think of an organ, we said an organ was a structure that's formed of at least two or more tissues, but most organs have several tissues. It's not, 2, 3, 4. It's usually 5, 6, 7, or 8 different kinds of tissue that are present in any given organ. One more thing that I want to take a look at in regard to the four basic tissues is how they develop. And if we'll go to our overhead camera for just a moment, very early after fertilization, the primitive embryo, if we take a cross-section of it, we could divide the primitive embryo basically into 3 layers. We have an outer layer out here, and that outer layer is called ectoderm. There's another layer deep to that that's called mesoderm. And there's a lining layer around the primitive gut tube that's called endoderm. And these 3 are called the 3 primary germ layers. They are not tissues yet in the definitive sense, but they will differentiate into the 4 basic tissues. And that's what I want to just mention right here. The ectoderm actually forms all of the nervous tissue. I'm just going to write nervous. And some epithelium. I'll write some epi. Some epithelium. Mesoderm forms all muscle tissue. I'll just write muscle. It forms all connective tissue. I'll write CT. And it forms some epithelium as well. May have a little squashed here. The endoderm, the lining layer, forms some epithelium. So here you can see that epithelium develops from all 3 of the what we call primary germ layers. Muscle tissue and connective tissue come only from the middle layer, mesoderm. And nervous tissue, even though it's for the most part buried down within the body, we'll see how that happens later, actually comes from the outer layer of the developing embryo. And that's what this next graphic then will summarize in case you didn't get it all down. Let's take a look. Here we have summarized what we just drew out and talked about. Ectoderm, the outer of the 3 primary germ layers, just forms the outer part of the epithelium, and it also forms the nervous tissue of the body. Mesoderm, muscle tissue, connective tissue, and some of the epithelium that lines some of the body cavities and actually lines blood vessels as well. And finally, the endoderm gives rise to the epithelium that lines the alimentary canal and some of the associated structures. So those are the 3 primary germ layers which give rise to the 4 basic tissues, and in early development those 4 basic tissues continue to differentiate into their various subtypes that we mentioned a little bit earlier. Now, the extracellular matrix that's located in between cells varies from one basic tissue to another basic tissue. Some of the basic tissues have quite a bit of this material, and other of the tissues have very little extracellular matrix. Let's take a look at a graphic that summarizes that, which will help us understand these tissues a bit better. Within muscle tissue, besides the muscle cells, the extracellular matrix actually is a modified form of connective tissue proper. So the muscle cells are kind of interspersed, if you will, within a delicate connective tissue matrix. In epithelial tissue, there's very little extracellular material present. So it's basically cell to cell to cell, one epithelial cell making direct contact with the cell membrane of the next cell. With connective tissue, there's lots of extracellular matrix. Matter of fact, the extracellular matrix in some connective tissues is actually much more predominant than the cells themselves. And in nervous tissue, there's very little extracellular matrix present. So that kind of summarizes a comparison of the 4 basic tissues from using various criteria. Any questions about those 4 basic tissues? Eva?
I'm just wondering on that graphic, when it's listed connective tissue, it said that there's fibers and ground substance. What exactly is ground substance?
Good point. Let's go to the overhead for this. When we say extracellular matrix, this is a general term that implies anything that's found outside of the cells. In the connective tissues, there's 2 basic kinds of things here. There are fibers made of various kinds of proteins. And when we say ground substance, which is what you specifically ask about, that is a protein polysaccharide material that is amorphous. It has no particular form. Think of it as glue, okay? So if we were making adobe bricks, these would be the fibers would be the straw and the ground substance would be the mud. And it turns out that the cells actually make the fibers and they make the ground substance. And the ground substance kind of glues the fibers together and helps form a cohesive unit outside the cells then.
I have a question.
Susan?
So what kind of fiber and ground substance is in blood that makes it?
Now that's interesting. In blood, turns out that the ground substance is actually fluid and it's water, primarily water. 90-some% actually of the liquid portion of blood is water, and a very small percentage is organic material. The fibers within blood, when we get to, let's go to this overhead for just a second. When we get to connective tissue, we'll actually talk about all connective tissues have cells, fibers, and ground substance, okay? And the fibers and ground substance will collectively put together as that extracellular matrix. The cells of blood, of course, are red blood cells and white blood cells, RBCs and WBCs. We all know that. The fibers in blood are actually in the form of a protein called fibrinogen, which is water-soluble until the clotting mechanism is activated. So blood doesn't have true fibers in it until this material is converted by the clotting mechanism to fibrin, which actually forms fibers to help form the clot. And again, the ground substance in blood, blood being kind of an unusual tissue because it's the only liquid tissue, the ground substance in blood is mostly water. But there are some proteins and other organic materials within the plasma too. Other questions, Bryce?
I've heard the RBCs called red blood corpuscles. Why is that?
Actually, red blood corpuscles, RBCs, they lack nuclei. Now, while they're forming, while they're developing in bone marrow tissue primarily, they have nuclei. So the precursors to the circulating red blood corpuscles do have nuclei. But since red blood corpuscles, once they're out in the bloodstream, never reproduce out there, they don't need nuclei, and by extruding the nucleus, there's more room within the cell for hemoglobin, and so the cell is basically, or the structure is basically packed full of hemoglobin so it can carry more oxygen. And so often we call them red blood corpuscles rather than red blood cells to emphasize the fact that technically lacking a nucleus, we might not call it a cell anymore, but just a cell-like thing, a corpuscle. That makes sense?
Yeah.
While we're on nuclei, incidentally, and we'll get to this today and perhaps in our next session as well, but some cells have a single nucleus, most cells do. You know, the red blood corpuscles we just talked about lack nuclei altogether. And then there are some cells, of a few kinds of cells in the body that are actually multinucleated. Skeletal muscle cells are one of them that have multiple nuclei, and another cell that's found in bone tissue called an osteoclast has more than one nucleus. As a matter of fact, they have quite a few nuclei as well. All right, any other questions? Well then, let's go to muscle tissue and begin a specific discussion of muscle tissue. We said there were three kinds of muscle tissue a while ago: skeletal muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and smooth muscle tissue. Now, before we talk about those specifically, I want to get some terms clarified because there are some terms that float around that are a little bit confusing. So let's go to a graphic. When we say myofiber or muscle fiber, that's equivalent to saying myocyte or muscle cell. All four of those terms are synonymous and refer to a cell of muscle tissue, and it's not peculiar to any one of the three types of muscle tissue. Within the cytoplasm of a muscle cell, we find all of the regular kinds of organelles that cells have, but they also have a specialized organelle that's involved in the contractile process, and that's called a myofibril. So you can see how you have to be very careful when these first two terms here. Myofiber is a muscle cell. A myofibril is a contractile organelle found in the cytoplasm of a muscle cell. Finally, within the myofibrils, we find the actual contractile proteins that are involved in the shortening process that cause the contraction to occur, and those are called myofilaments. So make sure that you're careful on these three terms: cell, organelle, contractile protein. So we're down at the biological macromolecule level when we get down here. Okay. Now let's review those three types of muscle tissue one more time, just to make sure that we know what we're talking about. Then we're going to talk about the individual cells in each type just a little bit so that we can see how they structurally are different from each other. So we'll look at a graphic that shows the types of muscle tissue. And again, skeletal muscle tissue is found within the skeletal muscles and in the esophagus. Cardiac muscle tissue found within the heart and some of the large vessels near the heart, and smooth muscle tissue found within the walls of visceral body organs, within vessel walls, base of hair follicles, and within the eyeball. Now, how do these three kinds of muscle tissue, how are they separate or differentiated from each other? What's different about them? Anybody know what we mean by the word striated when we're talking about muscle tissue? From your reading, did you get that clarified? Adam?
Striated, striped, isn't it?
Striped. To a histologist looking at muscle tissue through a microscope, two of the kinds of muscle tissue are said to be striped or striated, which means they have, and you have to have pretty high power magnification to see this, but they have little zebra-like alternating light and dark bands across the cells. That's what we mean by striated. And it turns out that skeletal muscle tissue and cardiac muscle tissue have these striations. But if you're looking at a histologic section of smooth muscle tissue, the striations are simply not present. We'll talk about what causes those striations a little bit later. It's actually the organization of the contractile proteins within the cytoplasm that does it. When we say voluntary in relation to some kind of muscle tissue, what's the implication there? Somebody? Susan?
Voluntary would mean you would think about it before it moved, like a skeletal muscle. You would move voluntarily as opposed to your heart muscle is involuntary.
Cardiac muscle tissue, we can't start it or stop.
Beat, heartbeat.
Sure,
So
you
right.
bet. That's exactly it. When we talk about a muscle tissue being voluntary, that means we contract it when we decide to contract it. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't sometimes happen kind of on its own, like we're breathing, and that requires skeletal muscle tissue. We don't have to think about that. But we can stop breathing or start breathing, voluntarily if we do think about it. It turns out that skeletal muscle tissue is the only one of the three types that is voluntary. There are some other criteria, but let's just take a look at each one of the kinds of muscle tissue from some structural and functional standpoints. We'll look at this next graphic, which is on skeletal muscle cells and some of the peculiar things about them. Those cells are said to be voluntary. In other words, we can contract them when we decide. They are striated. When we look at them, high-power histologic magnification, we can see the stripes. The cells are said to be cylindrical. They're very elongated and kind of circular or more or less circular in transverse section. By multinucleated, we mean that there are several nuclei within one of these skeletal muscle cells. And by peripheral here, we mean that the nuclei are located out near the cell membrane. They're not located in the middle of the cytoplasmic area, but they're jammed out near the cell membrane. Reason for that is they contain so many contractile organelles that it shoves the nuclei out to the outside in a peripheral location. And these cells are quite large. 20,000 microns here for length, that's 2 centimeters. So you can basically see a skeletal muscle cell with your naked eye. They're big enough in diameter, 50 microns, 20,000. Some of the really biggest ones can be up to 3 or 4 centimeters in length. So they're quite large. Voluntary striated, cylindrical, multinucleated with peripherally located nuclei, and very large cells. Let's take a look at another graphic now that shows these same criteria. Oh, you have a question, Eva?
Yeah. I was wondering, how does a cell become multinucleated? I mean, when I learned about normal cell division, you only make one copy of all the DNA, and how do you
So
get
how
more
do
than
we
one
end up with multiple
nucleus
nuclei in
one
these
cell?
skeletal muscle cells? That's a good question. What evidently happens during early development is that when the nuclei divide, the cell membranes fail to come in to separate, so we end up then with nuclear division within an increasingly larger cytoplasmic mass. So you can think of that as happening as a developmental process where the nuclei divide, but the cytoplasm fails to do so. And so we end up with very large cells that have multiple nuclei. Good question. Any other questions before we go on? Yeah, Bryce?
Are there any other cells that you can just see with your eyes?
Neurons are long enough, but they're so small in diameter that you really can't pick them off. A human ovum is big enough. It's probably the biggest cell in diameter. It's 140 microns in diameter, roughly. It's about the size of a period in print, common printed period. So you can see those. But most cells individually are so small that you can't see them.
Okay.
Let's take a look at, oh, Adam, you had a question.
Yeah, how many things are we talking about? How many myofilaments are there within a myofibril? How many myofibrils within a myocyte, and how many myocytes within
It's
average muscle?
great big numbers, and I don't know what they are. But there's a lot of myofilaments within myofibrils, and a lot of myofibrils, and there's a lot of myofibrils within one muscle cell. Let's take a look at cardiac muscle cells very quickly here, just to compare the same criteria that we looked at. These are involuntary. In other words, we can't contract them when we want to. They are striated, do have the striations, the alternate dark and light stripings when you look at them in high power magnification. Cardiac muscle cells tend to be branched or kind of Y-shaped. They have a single nucleus as opposed to being multinucleated, and that nucleus, like the nucleus of most cells, is located somewhere near the central part of the cell. And these are much smaller, as you can see, only 15 microns by about 75 microns. Now, it's not important that you remember the exact number of microns or anything. I just want to show that up there so that you can see the relative sizes. And let's go to the next graphic and take a look at smooth muscle cells so we can complete this comparison. These cells are also involuntary. They are not striated. They have a fusiform shape, which means that they're kind of like an elongated football. They're fatter in the middle and skinny on the ends. They have a single nucleus that's centrally located, and they're quite small in diameter, but they're a little bit longer than cardiac muscle cells. So that compares the three kinds of muscle tissue. And that'll give us enough background on muscle tissue that when we start talking about various organs that contain one or more of these different kinds of muscle tissue, we'll have enough understanding to be able to hang our hat on it. And I want to do the same kind of thing now with epithelium. First of all, we classified epithelium a while ago into two categories. We said epithelium is either membranous epithelium or it's glandular. I want to spend a little bit of time on membranous epithelium. And let's go to the overhead camera. There's two things to know about the classification. First of all, membranous epithelial cells come in three shapes. They're either kind of globular. We're going to call that cuboidal. Let me write that out. I'm supposed to be printing here so that you can see understand my hieroglyphics. Or they are flattened. If we're looking at it on edge, kind of think of a fried egg on edge. You know, nucleus is going to be in the middle here. This is called squamous, if we're like that. Or they can be kind of hot dog-like, skinny and tall. And these kinds of cells are called columnar cells. So membranous epithelial cells are either cuboidal, squamous, or columnar, and they come in either one layer, one cell layer thick, or they're more than one cell layer thick. If they're only one cell layer thick, we call that a simple epithelium. If they're two or more layers thick, we call that stratified. And that's the criteria that we need to know to understand the classification of membranous epithelium, because membranous epithelium is going to be subdivided into several categories. If we have flattened cells that are one cell layer thick, we call that simple squamous. If we have globular cells that are one cell layer thick, we call that simple cuboidal. And columnar cells one layer thick, we call that simple columnar. And then, of course, if we got cells, more than one layer of cells, then we call it stratified, and the cells on the free surface are the ones that are used for the shape classification. So if we've got cells, several cell layers thick, but the ones up on top are flattened out, we call that stratified squamous epithelium. Does everybody understand what we're doing here, Bryce?
So you might have the columnar cells on the bottom and then have a different kind on top? Is that what you're
That's
saying?
true. You can have different kind deep than you do on the surface. The ones on the surface, though, are used for the classification, the ones on the free surface. Incidentally, when we talk about bottom or top, these cells actually sit on an amorphous, thin layer of stuff that they secrete themselves that's called the basement membrane. So they manufacture this material, it's a protein polysaccharide material, and then they sit on it, one layer thick or more than one layer thick, as the case may be, in various shapes. Let's go to the graphic here that just summarizes what we just said as far as classification of membranous epithelium, make sure that we've got those points down. 3 cell shapes, columnar, cuboidal, squamous, and then simple if it's one cell layer thick, or stratified if it's more than one. And that's basically the only classification criteria that we need to understand for membranous epithelium. Now let's go to a graphic that shows us simple squamous epithelium. We'll take a look at the kinds of places where we find it. This is one cell layer thick, and the cells are flat, like fried eggs on edge when you look at it in a cut section. Simple squamous epithelium lines blood vessels, it lines body cavities, it lines the pulmonary alveoli, and it even covers the glomerular vessels down here within the kidneys. So it's found in several different locations in the body. It's relatively porous in that it will allow things to pass through it with relative ease. And you can imagine that being the case since it's so thin. Now if we move to simple cuboidal epithelium, which we see in the next graphic, simple cuboidal epithelium, one cell layer thick, but the cells are kind of globular. This is also found in the kidneys. It's found in the thyroid gland, and it's also found lining some ducts in the body. Simple columnar epithelium, one cell thick, but the cells are elongated, kind of like little hot dogs bunched up together side to side. This lines the intestinal tract, and it lines the uterine tube. All right, any questions about simple epithelium as far as we just talked? Yeah, Eva?
You mentioned the basement membrane. Is that, you said it was a protein polysaccharide complex. Is that any different from the extracellular matrix we discussed earlier?
It's different protein and different polysaccharide, but it's the same idea. It's like making, doing a different mix on the concrete, doing a little coarser rock, a little finer sand, but it's the same general idea. It is. Yeah, Susan?
So do we find basement membranes in other types of tissues?
No, the
or
term,
just-
good question. The term basement membrane is really peculiar to membranous epithelium. We don't use it in conjunction with any other tissue in the body. There are some other membranes in the body, but we don't use the term basement membrane except in conjunction with membranous epithelium. All right, let's go to, we got a couple special cases of, let's go to the overhead camera for just a second. So if we had a basement membrane with cells that kind of look like little ice cubes or marshmallows sitting on it, one cell thick, we'd classify this and we'd say, well, that's simple cuboidal epithelium, right? Or if we had it, where we had the cells kind of like this, like little hot dogs, side to side, we say, well, that's simple columnar. There are a couple of special case situations. Here's one of them. Here's what the cells look like that line the air conducting passageways of the respiratory system. When you first look at this stuff, you kind of get the impression that we've got more than one layer of cells here. But when you look at it very carefully, you can see we just got some tall cells with some little short ones kind of jammed in between them. We got cells of differing heights, but they all make contact with down here with the basement membrane. This looks stratified, but it's not, and it's called pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Pseudostratified, false stratified columnar epithelium. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It's found only in the air-conducting passageways of the respiratory system. And it also has some cilia on the cell surfaces that are beating to move dirt-laden mucus up and out of the respiratory passageways. One other special case of simple epithelium, let's go back to the overhead camera. I want to show you one other case. It's really simple, simple epithelium, but it kind of looks stratified. When you look at the epithelium that lines the ureters and urinary bladder, this is kind of the impression that you get when you look through the microscope. It kind of looks like stratified cuboidal epithelium that's maybe 4 or 5 cells thick. Cells look kind of cuboidal, and it looks like we got 4 or 5 layers of cells here. This stuff is called transitional epithelium. And in reality, even though it looks stratified, it's not, because every one of these cells make direct contact with the basement membrane. It's just that these guys up here on top have a real skinny little pedicle that goes down to make the contact, kind of worms its way in between the others. And so it looks stratified again, but it's not. It's found only in some of the, lining some of the organs of the urinary system, and it's called transitional epithelium. So those are a couple special cases. Adam?
What's the purpose for the transitional epithelium? Why?
Well, it got its name because actually when the urinary bladder expands, when it fills with urine, these cells get stretched out, and because they all make contact, it'll end up looking, the cells flatten themselves out and almost comes down to where it almost looks like kind of a low cuboidal, simple cuboidal epithelium. But when they're all bunched together, when the urinary bladder is empty, say for example, then they have this appearance that kind of looks like 4 or 5 layers of cuboidal cells all stacked on top of each other. Susan?
Is that the same principle of the lungs with the pseudostratified?
Well, yeah, but that one doesn't change. Here we're not talking about changing, making significant diameter changes like we are, say, with the urinary bladder. But same idea. They all make contact with the basement membrane, so they're all only really 1 cell layer thick. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions? Let's look at a graphic that just summarizes the 2 things that I just said. Make sure that everybody can see those in print, that they can recognize. Transitional epithelium then lines ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra found in certain organs of the urinary system, and the pseudostratified columnar epithelium lines the air-conducting passageways of the respiratory system. Now, let's take a look at the next graphic, which shows us the stratified epithelia and where they are found. Stratified squamous epithelium is found covering the, it's the outer layer of the skin, really. There's 2 layers to the skin, and stratified squamous epithelium is the outer of those 2 layers. Stratified cuboidal epithelium lines some of the ducts in certain glands. And stratified columnar epithelium really hardly exists in the body. There's one little place that you can kind of find an example of it in the stomach, but it's not really important. So for all practical purposes, it doesn't exist. It's just barely there as a transitional type from when we're going from one kind of lining epithelium to another. Now, I realize that we just blew through that classification scheme, but I want to make sure that you understand we're not trying to give you, an in-depth histology course here. We just want you to understand what the various criteria used for classification happen to be. Anybody have any questions about that before we go on? Yeah, Adam?
Just to be clear, so it's contact with the basement membrane that determines whether it's going to be a simple or a stratified epithelial tissue?
Exactly. If all cells make contact, even if it's just a little tiny pedicle that comes down from the cell, if they all make contact with the basement membrane, even if they look like they're stacked on top of each other, It's truly a simple epithelium. And if we have what we call a stratified epithelium, then we've actually got cells that are stacked on top of other cells. Okay? Any other questions on those sorts of things? I want to go to glandular epithelium for a little bit. Let's go to our overhead camera. Of course, glandular epithelium is called glandular because it secretes something. And if it secretes that something into the blood, the product is a hormone. And we call that situation endocrine. We say that's an endocrine type secretion, an endocrine type glandular epithelium. If the secretory product produced by a glandular epithelium goes anyplace else, basically it's going to be onto some surface, a lining surface of an organ, or perhaps even the outer surface of the body, then the secretory product will be either sweat or bile or pancreatic juice or milk. It can be a lot of different things. Never a hormone. And we refer to this situation as exocrine. Now, I want to make sure that you understand that when we say glandular epithelium, we're talking about the tissue that does the secreting. The organ that has this glandular epithelium in it is called a gland. So, gland is at the organ level of classification, if you will. All glands contain glandular epithelium, and that's the tissue that actually does the secreting. Those same glands are going to have some connective tissue elements that help form their structure. They're going to have a blood supply, and so forth and so on. As a matter of fact, while we're talking about that blood supply, that is kind of an interesting thing. There are not very many structures in the body that don't have a blood supply. And membranous epithelium is one of those things. Glandular epithelium, we're talking about now, is well vascularized, has a lot of blood supply. But membranous epithelium is avascular. That means has no blood supply. Can anybody think of other structures in the body that lack a blood supply while we're on that subject? Eva?
Cartilage?
Cartilage. Mature cartilage has no blood supply. The cornea of the eye and the lens of the eye have no blood supply. So we got membranous epithelium, mature cartilage, lens of the eye, cornea of the eye. Those are the kinds of things that have no blood supply. At any rate, glandular epithelium is well vascularized, but membranous has no blood supply. There are many other classifications, terms used to classify glandular epithelium besides the exocrine and endocrine, but I think those are the ones that I want to make sure you understand. When we say exocrine, we're talking about some secretory product that does not go into the bloodstream. It goes out onto the surface of the skin, or it goes into the tubular lining of some visceral body organ. And there's a lot of different ones, and you can think of some of those, But if we use the term endocrine, the implication is that kind of secretory product, it goes into the bloodstream, and it's called a hormone. Okay? Bryce?
No, you mentioned sweat as one of the exocrine glands, but why does it stink?
That's a good question. Sweat is an exocrine product because it goes out, doesn't go into the bloodstream, goes out onto a body surface. Actually, there are two different kinds of sweat glands, Bryce. The glandular epithelium in one kind of sweat gland called merocrine sudoriferous glands. The actual sweat itself is a product that does not include any dead and deteriorating parts of cells. And that sweat, little kids sweat, but they don't stink. Us big kids sweat, and we stink, okay? And the reason for that is when at puberty, some other sweat glands develop in addition to the ones I was just mentioning, and these others, found primarily in the armpits and groin areas of the body, these others produce some sweat that has some broken off and deteriorating bits of cells within the secretory product. And it's those, pardon the expression, but rotting bits of cells that contribute to the odor that's associated with the sweat from those particular glands.
Okay.
Any other questions on that? Incidentally, let's go to the overhead camera since Bryce brought that up, and let's just mention what we call the modes of secretion here. If I can get it written. Merocrine. You'll also see this called eccrine. Apocrine. And holocrine. Here, no grossly visible part of the cell is lost in the secretory product. Here, part of the cell breaks away and enters the secretory product, but the cell doesn't die, just pieces of it break off and enter the secretory product. In this situation, like we find in the oil-producing glands in the skin, the actual secretory product is composed of dead cells. Here, the cells actually die and slough out, and the dead cells make the secretory product. So we have these three, these are called the modes of secretion of glandular epithelial cells. So of the various glandular epithelium in the body, some secretes this way, some secretes this way, and some secretes in the holocrine mode. Susan?
Could you give us some examples of each one of those so we would know?
Sure. On holocrine, again, the best example is probably the sebaceous glands, oil-producing glands of the skin. For apocrine, a good example would be mammary gland, producing milk. And again, for merocrine or eccrine, most of the sweat glands that are scattered out over most of the surface of the body have this mode. It's only the ones in the armpits and groin areas that are apocrine for sweat glands. Any other questions? Perhaps not. Well, we shall quit then.